I think we will see a very quick and dramatic change in customer attitudes towards how can you use sustainability and still make awesome products that are both good to ride and good for the planet.
So a bit of background on Erik, who we're so pleased to have with us today. You're an experienced innovation manager. You've studied civil engineering in Delft before working in the railway industry, where you oversaw projects in product development and process improvement. This is before you got involved in sustainability. You have a strong background in circular economy projects and co-founded Circular Cycling in 2018 to test business models in the cycling industry. Now you've pivoted your Circular Cycling into a consultancy, and you're director at the Shift Cycling Culture Foundation, a not-for-profit organization. We are here today to discuss your book called From Marginal Gains to a Circular Revolution, a practical guide to creating a circular cycling industry. The book helps people in the world of cycling to understand their role in circular business models and in design principles. So, with that intro, I'd love to ask you the first question.
Go for it.
So can you walk me through the tragedy of the commons and what this looks like in the biking industry?
The tragedy of the commons is a principle written by
Garrett Hardin, 1968.
Garrett Hardin in 1968 already, and it's a principle that he saw in a shared resource and how the shared resources should be or should not be managed. So a commons used to be like a pasture, a field, a shared field in a small village in the UK. And every villager was allowed to put a number of sheep on that pasture. But as you know, in nature, if too many sheep graze a field, then the grass will disappear and will no longer grow back. And therefore there will be no food for the sheep anymore. So there was a limit of number of sheep that you could graze on these commons. There's always this sort of inherent motivation within people to just put an extra sheep in, which benefits me, but then destroys the common lands in this case, and therefore also the opportunity for society to prosper as a whole on the long term. You see this tragedy of the commons everywhere. The climate change example is probably the most prominent one at the moment, where we as individuals emit more carbon into the atmosphere than is good for our planet. On the short term, it doesn't harm us. It benefits us. We can go places. We can heat our houses. But in the long term, we know that this is damaging our planet. It's hard to break this system. You also see this in the cycling industry, where there's a real focus on trying to outpace your competitor with what we call marginal gains in the book. So very small little changes that work to be different from your competitor and hopefully sell more products. But it's doing a lot of damage to the circularity of the system. And the cycling industry is a very linear economic system at the moment. Products are designed to be sold, but no one thinks about what happens at the end of the lifetime of these products. And what's happening now, for example, is that there's a reduction in the number of standards, therefore making it harder to find replacement parts and repair bicycles. And that is also a tragedy of the common problem, because we as a cycling industry, we want to create products that last long and have very little waste at the end of the lifetime. But at the same time, we're introducing all sorts of different standards and making maintenance and repairs harder and harder, and therefore reducing the lifetime of the products. But it's something that we would like to break and make this change to a circular economy.
That's incredible, and that's why we've brought you here today to tell us more about how the cycling industry can go about doing that. So first off, how do we convince generations outside of Gen Z of the importance of circular economy and also teach that sustainable business is profitable?
Well, first of all, it's not just Gen Z that thinks this is impossible. I'm not a Gen Zer, so there is hope. There's a number of things. First one is, I think 10 years ago, 15 years ago, everyone said climate change, that is something for my grandkids. I don't have to worry about. Unfortunately, the world is changing faster than we even imagined 10, 15 years ago, and climate change is already having an impact. This is no longer about kids or grandkids. This is about people, also older people. So we see the impacts now, and I think this is a very good reason to act. There's a lot of other reasons to start implementing the ideas of the circular economy. You can think of the rising cost of energy and material costs, especially the high energy intensive materials like steel, carbon fiber, aluminium that are used in bicycles. They are increasing because the energy prices have gone up so fast. Recycled materials use lots less energy and therefore are cheaper in the future. We've got a lot more international agreements coming up, especially the European Union is very good at introducing everything related to the Green Deal, so becoming a net zero economy and a circular economy in 2050, and trying to make these targets on the shorter term as well. So in 2030, there should be already a lot of legislation in place that will help companies or force companies to start making products that are more circular. An example is the carbon border adjustment mechanism that has just been introduced, taxing products that were produced outside the EU with the same carbon tax as products that are produced inside the EU. And this is having a global effect. Then there is finance. Large investors, such as pension funds, see more and more that investing in non-sustainable or non-circular companies pose a risk to their long-term revenues. So they try to shift their investments from, say, fossil fuel companies to more sustainable companies. Then there is staff. I think every company needs to look at his or her staff, especially if you're bringing in Gen Zers. They are very dedicated to the subject of sustainability. And if you want to get talent in, young talent, you have to address this. And if you don't, you will lose your talent at some point again. And finally, customers. Customers are spending the money where they think it is important, and they are more and more progressing to spend money in green products. We see this in the outdoor industry, which is very related to the cycling industry, of course. So if you go into an outdoor store and you're looking for a jacket, there's not a single one that hasn't got a label on it saying, this is more sustainable because of blah, blah, blah. And this is not yet happening in the cycling industry, but it definitely is a trend that is going to happen.
Sure. Do you think there's a way that the actual increased sustainability of different products could be easily documented or displayed for people, customers, talent in different industries to consider online? Is that already available?
Not so much for hard goods in the cycling industry. So for apparel, of course, you can look at the apparel industry. But in the hard goods, so in the bicycles itself, it's very hard to find this information, find reliable information. But it's definitely something that's going to change in the near future because of regulation, for example, by the EU on the embedded carbon in products. But there's so many assumptions currently being made to provide this kind of information that it's very hard to make a proper claim on how sustainable a bike is being manufactured.
Sure. So in your book, you offer an entire checking system to determine whether a certain product or bicycle is part of the circular economy. So what incentives can top-down government-type systems implement to ensure that bicycle parts don't end up in the landfills or in incineration or in recycling?
Yeah, so what we're trying to do is transition from this linear system, take, make, waste, into a system where materials flow forever and ever. They'll go from product to resource, back into product, and so on. And I think regulation has got a very important role to play here. And I'm very happy, for example, with a legislation that was passed in the EU just this week about batteries. So they forced battery manufacturers for larger batteries, like, for example, e-bikes, but also electric vehicles, to provide every single battery with a product passport. That includes the capacity, the performance, the durability, etc., but also the performance of the battery over the lifetime and the information required to recycle that product at the end of the lifetime. And the beauty of this is that once you have this product passport and you have another piece of this legislation in place where the EU says you need a minimum content of recycled materials in your new battery, all of a sudden you get this innovation cycle going where producers are required to use recycled materials. So they will have to source that recycled materials. And that's going to be costly if you don't design your battery right. But if you then redesign your battery to make it designed for recycling, the cost will go down. It will be easier to recycle your materials. So being forced to start using recycled content will spin this cycle of making better or designing better products for the end of the lifetime.
Mm-hmm. What incentives do you think are the most effective ones?
It's probably this sort of legislation. So the carbon tax and also forcing a recycled content, for example, or a bio-based content in a product.
Mm-hmm.
And what I like to see is that we have a government in the cycling world, the UCI,
Mm-hmm.
to tell bike manufacturers, if you want to enter a race, for example, World Championships of Cycling or the Olympic Games, then your bike needs to be made out of 25% bio-based materials or 25% recycled materials, or preferably even 100% circular materials, of course. But by setting this type of regulation, you force manufacturers to start innovating, find alternatives from what they've been doing for so long, and make this transition into a circular economy.
Mm-hmm. You call the bike passport a goldmine of data. What kinds of technology would you use to collect, store, and process this data? And would you make the data available to everyone?
Yeah, so information is a super important part of making this end of life or even during the lifetime of a product more sustainable. What we want to create is products that last longer and at the end of life can make their way back into the economy instead of ending up in an incinerator or in a landfill. And when we set up circular cycling a few years ago, one thing we really struggled with was the lack of information. So about compatibility of parts, of availability of spare parts, installation manuals, etc. And I think that should be all be stored in a bike passport. Um, but when you're talking about the technology of sort of how this should be done, I am not an expert in IT systems. I'm a forward-thinking user, and I'm more interested in how do you use this technology than in the technology itself. But what I would like to see is to have everything related to my bicycle in one place. So on my phone, everything from the invoice, the measurements of my bike fits, where do I find spare parts? I would even like to make an appointment with my local bike store to say I need this and this part replaced. Which bike store has availability and has all the spare parts in place, so they can do my fix fast. And also, what happens at the end of the lifetime? What can I do with the parts that have broken down or the entire bike? How can I make sure that this is going back into the circular system instead of me throwing it out in the general waste bin or wherever I think is most suitable for my location? So, getting back to your question, which platform, which technology? I'm not that fussed about this as long as it's easy to use, it is future proof, there's one standard. So how do you use this type of data? But ideally with multiple platforms that can tap into this data and share it with the user. So there's not a monopoly on this data, but more people can use this. And I think privacy is super important. I want to make sure that everything, all of the data that I put into this passport is safe and will not be available to anyone, just like, with data leaks and stuff like that.
Of course. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, that's part of what is driving what we're working on at Olyn. I mean, we're thinking about a decentralized system, so a blockchain system that allows the information to not be stored in silos, but rather to be anonymized and available while also still private to the individual. Um, so, moving on to a different question. Toward the end of your book, you make actual recommendations for event organizers, media groups connected to events like Peloton. Can you speak to these sustainability recommendations a bit more?
Yeah, so what I try to do in my book is really, if you want to transform a linear economic system like the cycling industry into a circular system, you need to include every single stakeholder. So from governments to bike manufacturers to the people promoting the bike in the media as well as in the racing, and also the users. And the cycling industry is very interested that we have such a large sports outlet, right? The bike racing, the Tour de France, the World Championships, the mountain bike races on the TV. They are promoting the sport, getting people excited about brands. And that's why people sponsor the races as well. There's a huge audience, but also a huge system to sort of make people realize that sustainability is important and how you can change. And I think the pro peloton has got a very big role to play in just showing how things can be done different. And if you see a pro riding a circular bike, then you will see that a lot of people will want to own one of those bikes as well. So there's a lot of opportunity if the pro peloton starts to really embrace sustainability as part of their mission, and then the media covering that sustainability item as well, I think we will see a very quick and dramatic change in customer attitudes towards how can you use sustainability and still make awesome products that are both good to ride and good for the planet.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. Good for the customer, good for the planet. I'm in. So thank you so much, Erik Bronsvoort, for coming in today to talk with us. Hoping you'll keep going with your journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much.